Egypt now taking a hard line against anti-government protests, but new threats, mass arrests and a crackdown on gatherings haven't silenced the calls for change. Protesters demanding the resignation of President Hosni Mubarak took to the streets of Cairo and other cities for a second straight day. But this time, riot police were ready, using water cannon, tear gas and at times batons and rubber bullets to disperse the crowds. The government says at least 4 people have been killed in the clashes, 3 protesters in Suez and 1 policeman in Cairo. Hundreds of people have been arrested. We're now hearing reports that protesters in Suez have set a government building on fire. Let's get right to Ben Wiedemann, who is in Cairo for you tonight. Ben?
Yes, Becky, it does seem that even though the government is trying to crack down on these protesters, and this morning the Interior Ministry said no protests would be tolerated, they're growing, they're spreading. We're hearing from the city of Suez on the Suez Canal that the protesters have almost taken over the entire city. Here in Cairo, we've had sort of rolling protests around the city, starting from around noon. I'm hearing in one part of town, not far from here, that hundreds, thousands of people are gathering, that the police have withdrawn from that area. What I think we're beginning to see is that the state simply is incapable of, rather its security forces are dealing with the size, the breadth, the number of protesters who are keeping up this pressure on the government, continuing to demand the ouster of President Hosni Mubarak. Becky?
Ben, let's just make it clear. What's the sort of classic profile of the protesters on the street, if any, in Cairo at the moment?
There is no profile, and that's the thing that I was stunned by yesterday. You have middle-aged couples coming out to join the demonstrations, students, office workers, factory workers, kids, women with babies in their arms, Christians, Muslims. It seems to be a very broad spectrum of Egyptian society, all of them with the same demand. They want change. They want a new government. They're tired of the same thing year after year, and I think that's what shocked people. It's not a protest being led, for instance, by the biggest opposition bloc in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood. If anything, they were as stunned as everybody else by the size and the passion of these protests. Becky?
Ben, stay with me. I just want to get the viewers a couple more elements on this story. It's clear the government's patience with the protesters has run out, but just yesterday, Egypt's foreign ministry spokesman told us here at CNN that the demonstrators, quote, have the right, all the right in the world to say what they want. Well, I spoke a bit ago with that spokesman, Hossam Zaki, asking him first why the government has now banned street demonstrations.
This is really a peculiar situation because protests are not organized anymore. In any country in the world, when you have protests, you have due process to follow, not just widespread movements throughout the streets where some people who want to introduce chaos and or any other action can have a feast. This is not something that is conducive to law and order. So the authorities are doing what they are requested and supposed to do.
Which is using tear gas, water cannon and other things too.
Many countries in the world and in many cities, including in the West, tear gas and water cannons used to disperse demonstrators when the situation cannot be controlled by any other means.
But yesterday you said that this was very different from that which you'd seen in Tunisia. You said that people were free to demonstrate.
Well, it is true that people are free to demonstrate when demonstrations are following due process and when demonstrations are peaceful. This is absolutely true, and it still holds.
I wonder whether the White House will be interested to see what you mean by due process. Earlier today, they expressed support for the universal rights of the Egyptian people, including the right to freedom of expression, association and assembly. Your government isn't respecting that at the moment, and you're telling me they're not going to overturn the ban, are you?
Well, let me be clear, Becky. The responsibility of preserving law and order in our country lies with the Egyptian government and the Egyptian authorities only. We do not accept any diktat from any other nation of the world or any other capital in this matter. This being said, we do have now a history, albeit a recent history, for about 6 years now, of demonstrations being embraced by our political system as part of our democratic practice that is happening. And this is not something that we are totally alienating.
We spoke to one of the leaders of an opposition group, Mohammed El-Baradei, yesterday on this show, who said that the reason that people have taken to the streets is that it is impossible, and these are his words, impossible to engage the government any other way. He says he's been trying to engage with the regime for over a year with demands for free and fair elections. So, for example, if you were to cave to some of the protesters' demands, it would be that somebody like El-Baradei were to be able to stand in the election for president. So, will that happen?
Well, I want to tell you, Becky, that we have a political system. In order to engage in this political system, you have to play by the rules. If you want to change the rules, that is a completely different proposition. From what I understand, the political system in our country, that is much more plural than any of the other neighboring countries in our region, and that is much more tolerant and much more free in many, many respects, has all the ability to absorb all those who oppose it.
The voice there of Hossam Azaki, who is the Egyptian foreign minister's spokesman, speaking to me earlier on. Well, the United States may not agree with the way that Egypt is handling the protests, but it's choosing its words carefully, as President Mubarak is a long-time ally whose cooperation is critical, of course, on a number of fronts. Coming up this hour, we're going to get the United States' take on the political unrest from State Department spokesman P.J. Crowley. For now, let's bring back Ben Wiedemann in Cairo. Ben, your thoughts on what you just heard?
Well, it's interesting what Hossam is saying, and he's right in one sense. Egypt, compared to many other countries in the Arab world, is far more freer. You have a very active, independent and party press. Traditionally, Egyptians have been able to express themselves in ways that people in Syria or Iraq under Saddam Hussein never could. But there's also some other issues that he didn't mention. People have been protesting more in the last 6 years than they have before, but oftentimes those protests are met by plainclothes policemen who beat the hell out of the protesters. I've seen women demonstrators who were peacefully demonstrating in small groups being dragged by their hair down the street and sexually molested by the police. This has happened many times. We've also seen cases where people have been dragged out of cafes and beaten to death by the police. That's one of the main complaints of Egyptians, is police brutality. And this seems to be endemic. You hear on a regular basis of people who go to the police station and end up dead. So there are things that make Egypt unique in the Arab world. It's relative freedom, but you have police brutality. You have rampant corruption. The problems are real. At the same time, we must credit Egypt for certain things. As I said, a free press, a society where people can express their grievances. But the government draws a very stark line. When you step over that line, your life can be in danger. Becky?
Ben, what happens next?
That is the big question. Becky, everybody in Egypt was shocked by the size of the demonstrations yesterday. Everyone was expected limited demonstrations, a tough police response. But what we saw was an outpouring of passion, of anger, of pent-up frustration from decades being expressed in the streets. And today, of course, as I mentioned before, the government is trying to crack down on it, but it doesn't seem to be able to put a stop to it. Nobody knows where it's going, and it would be a fool who predicts where it is going, because this situation is completely unpredictable. Becky?
Ben Wiedemann in Cairo reporting from there. Ben, we thank you for that. Well, Tunisia's